Currently, Earth. On June 25th in 1876, Native American forces led by Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull defeat U.S. Army troops of Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer in the Battle of Little Bighorn near southern Montana's Little Bighorn River. Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, Lakota Sioux leaders, strongly resisted the mid-19th century efforts of the U.S. government to confine their people to reservations. In 1875, after gold was discovered in South Dakota's Black Hills, the U.S. Army ignored previous treaty agreements and invaded the region. This betrayal led many Sioux and Cheyenne tribesmen to leave their reservation and join Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse in Montana. By the late spring of 1876, more than 10,000 Native Americans had gathered in a camp along the Little Bighorn River, which they called the Greasy Grass. This in defiance of a U.S. War Department order to return to their reservations or risk being attacked. In mid-June, 3 columns of U.S. soldiers lined up against the camp and prepared to march. A force of 1,200 Native Americans turned back the first column on June 17th. 5 days later, General Alfred Terry ordered Custer's 7th Cavalry to scout ahead for enemy troops. On the morning of June 25th, Custer drew near the camp and decided to press on ahead rather than wait for reinforcements. At midday, Custer's 600 men entered the Little Bighorn Valley. Among the Native Americans, word quickly spread of the impending attack. The older Sitting Bull rallied the warriors and saw to the safety of the women and children, while Crazy Horse set off with a large force to meet the attackers head-on. Despite Custer's desperate attempts to regroup his men, they were quickly overwhelmed. Custer and some 200 men in his battalion were attacked by as many as 3,000 Native Americans. The Battle of Little Bighorn, also called Custer's Last Stand, marked the most decisive Native American victory and the worst U.S. Army defeat in the Long Plains Indian War. Today, we remember all human souls who continue their eternity on this day. On June 25th in 1950, armed forces from North Communist North Korea smashed into South Korea, setting off the Korean War. Korea, a former Japanese possession, had been divided into zones of occupation following World War II. U.S. forces accepted the surrender of Japanese forces in Southern Korea, while Soviet forces did the same in Northern Korea. Like in Germany, however, the temporary division soon became permanent. The Soviets assisted in the establishment of a communist regime in North Korea, while the United States became the main source of financial and military support for South Korea. On June 25th in 1950, North Korean forces surprised the South Korean army and quickly headed towards the capital city of Seoul. The United States responded by pushing a resolution to the UN Security Council calling for military assistance to South Korea. Russia was not present to veto this action as it was boycotting the Security Council at the time. With this resolution in hand, our 33rd President, Harry S. Truman, rapidly dispatched U.S. land, air, and sea forces to Korea to engage in what he termed a police action. The American intervention turned the tide, and U.S. and South Korean forces marched into North Korea. This action, however, prompted the massive intervention of Communist Chinese forces in late 1950. The war in Korea subsequently bogged down into a bloody stalemate. In 1953, our country and North Korea signed a ceasefire that ended the conflict. The ceasefire agreement also resulted in the continued division of North and South Korea at just about the same geographical point as before the conflict. The Korean War was the first hot war of the Cold War. Over 55,000 American troops were killed in the conflict. Korea was the first limited war, one in which the U.S. aim was not the complete and total defeat of the enemy, but rather the limited goal of protecting South Korea. For the U.S. government, such an approach was the only rational option in order to avoid a third world war and to keep from stretching finite American resources too thinly around the globe. It proved to be a frustrating experience for the American people, who were used to the kind of total victory that had been achieved in World War II. The public found the concept of limited war difficult to understand or support, and the Korean War never really gained popular support. On this day, we remember all human souls who continue their eternity as a result of this conflict. On June 25th in 1950, an American team composed largely of amateurs defeated its more polished English opponents at the World Cup, held in Belo Horizonte, Brazil. Dubbed the Miracle on Green, the game is considered one of the greatest soccer upsets of all time. The English team at the time, known as the Kings of Football, boasted a record of 23 victories, 4 losses, and 3 draws in the years since World War II ended. Its members were professional footballers culled from the England's domestic leagues. The Americans, by contrast, had lost their last 7 international matches. Hastily assembled just days before the match against England, the U.S. team included a dishwasher, 2 mailmen, a teacher, and a meal worker. The Belfast Telegram described them as a band of no-hopers, drawn from many lands, ostensibly because some of the men were recent immigrants to the U.S. By the time the two teams squared off at Belo Horizonte, bookies had given the Brits 3-1 odds to take the World Cup, compared to 500-1 for the Americans. The end result being the no-hopers defeating the Kings of Football with a single goal. Appalled English fans could not fathom that the Americans had beaten them at their own game. In the U.S., meanwhile, the improbable win barely made a ripple. Only one American journalist had traveled to Brazil for the World Cup in the first place, Dent McSkimming of the St. Louis Dispatch, who paid his own way when his newspaper would not send him. He later said that the American victory was as if Oxford University sent a baseball team over here and it beat the Yankees. This story didn't really make headlines in our country at the time because, for one thing, soccer had never captured the same U.S. fan base as football, baseball, or basketball. After the upset, both teams were quickly eliminated and returned to their respective sides of the Atlantic. The Brits chastened, the Americans essentially ignored. It would be 16 years before England won its first and only World Cup title. The United States, meanwhile, will not even appear in the tournament again until 1990. On June 12, 2010, the teams met again at the World Cup in Rustenburg, South Africa, and again England was the favorite. The match, which was the fifth most watched soccer game in U.S. history, ended in a draw. On June 25th in 1956, the last Packard, the classic American luxury car with the famously enigmatic slogan, "Ask the man who owns one," rolls off the production line at Packard's plant in Detroit, Michigan. Mechanical engineer James Ward Packard and his brother William Dowd Packard built their first automobile, a buggy-type vehicle with a single-cylinder engine, in Warren, Ohio in 1899. The Packard Motor Company earned fame early on for a four-cylinder aluminum speedster called the Grey Wolf, released in 1904. It became one of the first American racing cars to be available for sale to the general public. With the 1916 release of the Twin Six, with its revolutionary V12 engine, Packard established itself as the country's leading luxury car manufacturer. World War I saw Packard convert to war production earlier than most companies, and the Twin Six was adapted into the Liberty aircraft engine, by far the most important single output of America's wartime industry. Packards had large, square bodies that suggested an elegant solidity, and the company was renowned for its hand-finished attention to detail. In the 1930s, however, the superior resources of General Motors and the success of its V16 engine pushed Cadillac past Packard as the premier luxury car in America. Packard diversified by producing a smaller, more affordable model, the 120, which increased the company's sales. During that era, the coming of World War II halted consumer car production in our country. In the post-war years, Packard struggled as Cadillac maintained a firm hold on the luxury car market, and the media saddled the lumbering Packard with names like bathtub or pregnant elephant. With sales dwindling by the 1950s, Packard merged with the much larger Studebaker Corporation in the hope of cutting its production cost. The new Packard Studebaker became the fourth largest manufacturer of cars in the nation. Studebaker was struggling as well, however, and eventually dropped all its own big cars as well as the Packard. In 1956, Packard Studebaker's then president, James Nance, made the decision to suspend Packard's manufacturing operations in Detroit. Though the company would continue to manufacture cars in South Bend, Indiana until 1958, the final model produced on June 25, 1956 is considered the last true Packard. On June 25th in 1993, in Ottawa, Canada, Campbell is sworn in as Canada's 19th Prime Minister, becoming the first woman to hold the country's highest office. Born in Port Alberni, British Columbia in 1947, Campbell studied law and political science before entering Canadian politics during the 1980s. In 1986, she was elected to the British Columbia legislature as a Conservative, and 2 years later, she was appointed Minister of Indian Affairs by Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. In 1988, she became the first female to hold the office of Canadian Attorney General and proved instrumental in the movement to increase gun control in Canada. In 1993, Campbell was appointed Minister of National Defense and Veterans Affairs. 2 months later, Prime Minister Mulroney announced his resignation, and Campbell was encouraged to run for the Conservative Party leadership. In a close contest, she was elected at a national convention on June 13th, and on June 25th took office as Canada's first female Prime Minister. Prime Minister Campbell won widespread public approval, but the Conservative mandate to govern had nearly expired. She was forced to call for a general election to be held in October. On October 25, 1993, the Conservatives' 9 years at Canada's ruling party came to a decisive end. Voters had become disenchanted with the party after enduring higher taxes and constitutional crisis under Mulroney, and the Conservatives were reduced to just 2 seats in the House of Commons. Campbell herself lost her Vancouver seat and retired from politics. She returned to academic life, accepting a fellowship at Harvard University. She later served as Canada's Consul General to Las Vegas. All historic information documented on this audio file can be found and verified on history.com.